What is up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Backup Fantasy Sports. It is Friday, April 21st. My name is Euan, and on today's episode, we will be getting into some 2023 Azerbaijan Grand Prix preview. It's been a long break from F1. I did some videos on the channel on some chip strategy and best of the back markers to talk about who would be the best low-cost asset in our F1 fantasy teams. So check those out if you have some time. Would really appreciate it. Those are kind of evergreen content. But for now, let's just get right into it with the Australian Grand Prix review. It's been over a month since that race happened. Well, 3 weeks, I guess. But by the time we have the race in Baku, it will be almost a month that we've gone without F1. It was a crazy race. 3 red flags for the first time in Formula One history. A lot of debate about if those flags were necessary at some points. Maybe the first one was good with Albon. The Magnussen one, questionable. And then the restart was just total madness. But Saturday qualifying was fairly normal with Max Verstappen taking pole. The only kind of upset was Sergio Perez beached his car in Q1 and was not able to set a time. So he started 20th on Sunday's race. He actually started from the pit lane with Valtteri Bottas. But yeah, another strong qualifying for Nico Hülkenberg, who we talked about in the best of the back markers, which is not necessarily good for his F1 fantasy prospects, but oh well. And then on the race on Sunday, I actually had to watch the highlights again this morning just to remind myself what went down in that race. Some crazy overtakes from Sergio. Lando Norris had a pretty good battle with Nico Hülkenberg. And then on the restart on lap 56 or 57, it was total chaos. But at the front of the pack, it looked very similar to what we are used to over the last few years of Formula One, with Max Verstappen 1 and Lewis Hamilton 2. Fernando Alonso did get clipped on that restart, but they decided to. It was kind of like the Silverstone thing from last year where Zhou Guanyu had that scary crash. On the restart, they couldn't determine if all the cars went through the first sector before they threw the red flag. So they decided to go to the starting order from the second red flag restart. And there was a lot of kerfuffle about that. Carlos Sainz got hit with a 5-second penalty. So he went from, I believe, 4th all the way to out of the points in 12th. So not a good day for Ferrari, as Charles Leclerc also DNF'd on the first lap. He got clipped by Lance Stroll. I believe George Russell also suffered a DNF after getting pretty unlucky with his pit strategy. The Alex Albon crash in turn 3, I believe he decided to pit on the yellow or on the safety car, go on the hard, but then they threw up a red flag right afterwards. So his strategy was out the window for the day. And tough day for Russell, I think it was his engine was wildly on fire going down the straight on turn 1. So tough day for him. But Lewis Hamilton back on the podium and Fernando Alonso right there as well. Steady Eddie for this season. Some facts and stats from the Australian Grand Prix. The optimal team ended up being Sergio Perez with the DRS boost because he started 20th and gained all of those positions and the overtakes. So quite a good day for him. But Verstappen, Alonso, Stroll, and Zhou Guanyu finishing in the points would have given you 351 points. That would have been the optimal team. But no one had the DRS boost on Perez. It was probably on Verstappen, and maybe some people had it on Perez, but I would have been surprised if that was the choice. Positions gained there: Perez with 15, Bottas 9, Zhou Guanyu, and Oscar Piastri finally getting in the points in his home race. They had a lot of positions gained. Overtakes there: Perez again. That Red Bull was just flying around the Melbourne circuit. The long straight there, Sergio Perez was doing some audacious overtakes, but it was great fun to see, even though it was quite scary how powerful that Red Bull was. And fastest pit stop finally came through for Red Bull. Not a lot of teams actually ended up having to pit during the race because there were so many red flags that they could really just do that or change their tires during those stops. But Red Bull came out on top with the top 2 fastest times. Over to the overall season standings here. So if you watched my best of the back markers video, I started doing the PGO points, which is points gained plus overtake points. Is kind of, since most of those back markers were not finishing in the top 10, we had to figure out how to differentiate them from the rest of the pack. So I've kind of brought that over to the overall standings here. So PGO points, total points, points per race, and points per million, just to kind of get a whole grasp of the scene. Verstappen up top there with 2 race wins already and a second place in 2023, going strong for the Dutch driver. Sergio Perez had a strong Australia despite his qualifying mishap. Alonso there as the best bang for your buck value. Hamilton, Sainz, Zhou Guanyu's had a couple of good finishes, so he's definitely at the top of my back markers want list for this upcoming race. Russell would have been strong as well, but he just had that DNF. And it was good to see Lando Norris put together a strong performance in Australia. Down here, we've got most of the DNFers. Charles Leclerc now has 2 DNFs in 3 races for 2023, so not a good start. He's doing the same thing as Max Verstappen did in 2022, but I don't feel as good about Ferrari bouncing back like Red Bull did in the 2022 season. Alex Albon has now DNF'd in back-to-back races, so he was having a great weekend in Australia. He was going super strong. There's actually a really interesting video of their team principal, James Vowles. I probably butchered that pronunciation, but he was explaining what actually happened to Alex Albon's car in Australia and why he crashed. So I would definitely recommend going to check that out on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. It was on one of those places, but certainly disappointing for Albon because he's actually super strong in the races. Just is having some unfortunate luck there. Nico Hülkenberg, his thing is he qualifies so well, but then 3 PGO points. So he actually does fairly poorly during the race, but he got on the board in Australia there with a pretty strong finish. After that second red flag restart, he was actually in 4th. Haas would have, I think they protested the result after the race, but it was quickly dismissed. But still a good weekend for Hülkenberg and Haas there, as Kevin Magnussen caused the second red flag with his tire just hitting the wall and just bouncing all the way down the track. It was quite crazy to see. I think Joylan Palmer on Formula1.com has a pretty good tech talk video about if that should have been a red flag or not. So I would also recommend going to check that out. Constructors points here. No surprise right now. Red Bull just storming out on top. I've broken it down here to Q points per race and R points per race. Q points being qualifying points, R points being just race day, Grand Prix points. And you can see Red Bull's just so far out ahead there. But Aston Martin still is the best bang for your buck. Mercedes has only 1 DNF this season, while Ferrari has 2 or 3. I don't remember. But yeah, so it's been a tough start for those 2 guys. But Mercedes clawing it back. They're starting to kind of challenge Aston Martin in a points per race, but just not in the same stratosphere for bang for your buck. And Zhou Guanyu's strong performance has actually made Alfa Romeo pretty good value, but why would you go there when Aston Martin is just a little bit more money, but you can get so many more points for your buck? But yeah, all the way down there, Williams with the 2 DNFs and back-to-back races for Alex Albon sitting at the bottom. McLaren kind of, sort of trying to get back into it, but we will see. There's been almost going to be a whole month between Australia and Azerbaijan, so it'll be interesting to see if any teams have made progress in what they've seen from the first 3 races, if there's any big jumps, any updates coming. A lot of information to be gained over the next week, so definitely keep your ear to the ground and checking Formula1.com for any up-to-date news, and get on the Discords for F1 Fantasy Tracker and F1 Fantasy Tools and the F1 Fantasy Reddit. Driver of the day could have been Max Verstappen, but he had a pretty easy day after he overtook Lewis Hamilton. like a few laps into the race once DRS got going. So Sergio Perez, he had a super strong day, qualified 20th, finished 5th. All those position gains, overtake, fantasy points 52. He's been a pretty good bang for your buck asset here in F1 Fantasy, 2.2 points per million, which is third highest this season. And the 52 points is actually the second highest single score in a race this year. Verstappen's 61 in Saudi Arabia after he started 15th. Driver changes. It was a pretty interesting week for driver changes. It wasn't as volatile as I know a lot of people, including myself, would like to see, but it was probably the most movement that we've seen throughout the season. So here are the risers. We've got Alonso, Hamilton, Stroll, Verstappen, Perez, and Lando Norris. So that was encouraging to see that some of the prices were going up. Alonso seems to be clicking over at 0.2 a race, so he will eventually get up there. But a lot of teams already had him from the get-go, so everyone's budget is just rising there. Same with Verstappen and Perez. Very strong assets to keep in the game. Stroll was a little bit up for debate, and it would have been a lot more interesting kind of going into Azerbaijan if Pierre Gasly had avoided his crash on the restart there in Australia, because Gasly was having a fantastic race, riding in 5th for the majority of it, and was looking really good in that Alpine. And then he just took himself and his teammate Esteban Ocon out of the race. So unfortunate there for Alpine, but could be up for debate maybe later in the season. But still, Aston Martin have such a strong car, and it's going to be tough to kind of get away from the meta. If you're brave, if you're feeling bold this early in the season, Lance Stroll could see the outside of your team if you want to go with Gasly. But for now, I think we should just play steady Eddie and maybe just wait for that disappointment to come, because Stroll would have been way up here as well if he had not had his DNF in Saudi Arabia. The fallers here, lots of fallers. We had tons of people. Technically, there was DNFs, and then the only 3 people that officially DNF'd according to the F1 fantasy game were Charles Leclerc, Alexander Albon, and George Russell. But they, the rest of them that all crashed on the second red flag restart, completed 90% of the race, so they did not receive the -20. But a lot of them still fell in price here, with Nick De Vries, K-Mag, Pierre Gasly, Esteban Ocon, Logan Sargent. They all kind of crashed on that restart. Kevin Magnussen causing that second red flag. So they all went down in price, but overall, not a lot to be gained or lost in these price changes as of right now. But it was encouraging that there was more price changes. That was probably a result of the race. It would be interesting to see what goes down after Azerbaijan this weekend, especially because it is the first sprint weekend of the season. There's going to be 6 this year. You should check out my chip strategy podcast or video to just kind of get a overview of those races and what we could potentially be doing throughout the season here with the chips. But yeah, the driver price changes were pretty encouraging. I liked how many went up and down. I have Logan Sargent in my team. I have Logan Sargent on my shirt, but I think this will probably be the last race that I have him for now, unless he kind of picks it back up a little bit. Going over to the constructor price changes, no surprise with Red Bull and Aston Martin going up, but all 4 of Ferrari, Alpine, Williams, and AlphaTauri going down, with Williams, neither driver finishing the race. Same with Alpine. Ferrari went down in price. It would have been interesting to see if they would have gone down in price if Carlos Sainz had finished 4th. But we will never know, as he did protest it to the FIA earlier this week, and it was quickly dismissed. I believe he has taken to social media to speak out about that decision. Haven't actually seen it myself yet, though. But yeah, Red Bull, Aston Martin kind of keeping the meta here. they're very strong assets. Red Bull's just overpoweringly good with their car, their pit stop ability. They qualify high, they finish high. No need to get away from them there. And Aston Martin is just so stinking cheap that why would you go near any other guy unless the car starts to fade? Then the game might get a little bit more interesting. But right now, Aston Martin is just too cheap to not have in your F1 fantasy squad. But finally, we get to the Azerbaijan Grand Prix preview, the Baku City Circuit, the one with the castle, the one that's very pretty to look at in the F1 fantasy or the F1 video game. Sorry, I keep getting those confused. 51 laps, 20 corners, 2 DRS zones. Been around for a few years now. Very popular race. One of the best city circuits on the season calendar, if you ask me. It's just very interesting. And it's going to be a sprint weekend this weekend. Or next weekend. So that will make things even more exciting, more racing in Baku. Should spice things up a bit. I was looking at the DNFs from last season, and of the 6 tracks that have a sprint this weekend, I believe Baku had the most DNFs in 2022. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes along. Just looking back at last year's results here, it was the beginning. It was a different point of the season, the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, but Charles Leclerc qualified first, ended up DNFing, which became a trend for himself and Ferrari. Max Verstappen took the lead and never relinquished it. This is about the time that his dominance really started to come through over the course of the season. Sergio Perez second. George Russell was maintaining his steady Eddie top 5 streak there as well. But some crashes there, as you see, 4. I think there was a 5th one. Maybe that was at the end of the race. It was mechanical failure or something that was a DNF. But that's what we saw last year as the first year with the new cars. I would expect Red Bull to do very well here again this upcoming weekend. But the new schedule that has been rumored, apparently all 10 teams have agreed on this. The drivers are good to go. I guess it just needs to be officially approved by the FIA. So I guess it's not official, but it sounds like this is what the new schedule is going to be for sprint weekends moving forward. It turned out that a lot of people thought the second practice on Saturday morning was just a little redundant due to like the cars being locked after qualifying. So now on Friday, there will be one practice session with the qualifying for the Grand Prix, which will be taking Sunday. So Friday's qualifying will count for Sunday's starting grid. And then on Saturday, it's fully dedicated to the sprint with the sprint qualifying in the morning and then the sprint race at night. This is supposed to encourage more racing, have more teams go for it, because with the way that it was previously structured, the way you finished in the sprint race was how you started on Sunday's grid. So a lot of drivers and teams thought that that didn't really encourage people to really go for it. But now that the sprint is like solidly contained, we should see better racing. We should see more teams going for it because they don't have to worry about the sprint race compromising their Sunday race all that much. So qualifying on Friday will count for Sunday's starting grid. Saturday is its own little bubble, more racing, more action, hopefully more competition. For us as F1 fantasy players, managers, team principals, whatever you want to call yourself at night when you're thinking about your F1 fantasy team, to be determined on what this means for the game in terms of scoring. I'm hoping that they add it so that sprint qualifying counts for some kind of points in the thing. We'll see how it goes. I think it's probably, if I was a betting man, I don't think we would see anything in the game officially change until it's definitely approved by Formula One itself, just because it is the game through that website and organization. So I think we'd have to wait for that to all come out. But this is the new schedule as tentatively approved, I guess I would say. Looking forward to it. Should make for a lot more reason to watch. I'm sure it'll make some people mad, but more racing is always good. But yeah, the red flag thing from Australia was a lot of debate about, was it just the race directors trying to get a Hollywood style finish and just induce like a sprint finish kind of thing. But hopefully people are okay with this. I think better racing, more competition is going to be good for the sport, and it will mean more interesting things for our F1 fantasy teams. Interesting to see if the final fix chip will, for like, if you play the final fix chip after qualifying on Friday, in theory, you're supposed to get the rest of the points for the weekend from the driver that you flip on your final fix. But is that are you gonna be able to play it after sprint qualifying? If you play it after Friday's qualifying, will you be able to get all of the next 3 races? It's definitely something that I hope the game takes care of in the next week before this all goes down, so there's not some mad chaos, especially as I am going on vacation next weekend. So I will not be totally around my phone. So I would love to get that all sorted. But the simulations for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix this week, it's on f1fantasytracker.com. This is their wind tunnel system. It is fantastic. Like, props to those guys. I go there probably during the week leading up to the race a lot, see if anything's changed, especially after the practice sessions, which would be even more important this week with the sprint and not a lot of practice sessions going on at all. So right now they have Max Verstappen as the most expected points at 37.3, with Sergio Perez there at 31. Alonso's still your best value asset in the game there, 2.55 expected points per million. And then constructors here, no surprises, with Red Bull as the most expensive points, Ferrari's in second, and then for points per million, it's going to be Aston Martin and Red Bull right there. But another handy dandy feature on the wind tunnel is you can set different cost caps to see what the optimal team is supposed to be heading into the race. So the 104 million cap, no one is up there yet. There's a lot of teams that have hit every price rise possible, so props to them, but not even anyone has 104. I think this team at 104 million was 103.6. So that's where you need to be to get Verstappen times 2, Perez, Alonso, Stroll, and Piastri. But that's about as good as you would be able to get if you had been able to max out your cap. But that's just like the optimal team with like almost an unlimited budget. Not quite the limitless chip, but you know what I'm saying. The best team here, 102 million, is a lot more viable for a lot of teams here. So Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, Stroll, Tsunoda with Red Bull and Aston Martin. And the best team, if you're just starting off this week, your first week of the F1 fantasy season, you're creating a new team, the best team for 100 million that you should be looking at is Verstappen, Perez, Alonso, Tsunoda, and De Vries. My team, transfer options. It's kind of frustrating because I want to do more, but it's really tough to get away from the 3 Red Bull, 3 Aston Martin right now. Logan Sargent will have to go. I kept him in for Australia just to show faith in my fellow countrymen, but it's time to go. It's going to be for either Zhou Guanyu or Yuki Tsunoda. To be decided. I'm leaning Joe right now. In the best of the back markers video that I did earlier this month, you can just check it out on the channel if you click and subscribe and watch it there. But I kind of ranked all of them. I had Joe number 1, Tsunoda number 2, and I still had Sargent 3 just because he was so cheap. But I do think Joe has been one of the best drivers in that price range, and he keeps getting results. Alfa Romeo car doesn't seem to be that great. It's better than the Alfa Tauri car that Tsunoda's driving, but both of those drivers are actually having really good seasons. Tsunoda quietly chugging along, finally gotten the points there in Australia. And Joe he's had that fastest lap. When I posted the video, someone asked to break down the points without his fastest lap. I am going to do that. I'll hopefully post it on the F1 Fantasy Reddit sometime this weekend, as I am at home just packing for that trip. And chip options is something that I wanted to add to the My Team option here. So we've got 4 kind of options. You can obviously play your limitless chip or your wild card, but I don't get the best drivers and see what happens. I wouldn't play your wild card this early in the season unless you are so far away from the 3 Red Bull, 3 Aston Martin meta that you would need to take like a -12 to get there. But I can't imagine that's the case for a lot of people. No negative chip. I was pretty set on playing this when I did my chip strategy video, but it turns out that with the sprint races being, it's very like with the sprint races and the Grand Prix happening, it's very unlikely that we will actually have any negative drivers because they'll be able to make it up in the qualifying or the Grand Prix. So that was a great point made on the F1 Fantasy Tracker Discord. Autopilot might be worth it. Extra DRS, I think I want to save that for later in the season. Final Fix is the one that I want to wait for to see if the new options come up with the sprint qualifying, see how that reacts. But that's kind of where I'm thinking. Extra DRS maybe on Max Verstappen if there's nothing tricky going on. Red Bull should dominate this race. But that's going to do it for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix preview. Any likes on the video and subscriptions to the channel are greatly appreciated. But that's going to do it for me. I hope you enjoy having Formula One back. I think it's back-to-back with Azerbaijan. No video for me next time for the next race because I will be on vacation, but then I will be back and at it for the rest of the season. But once again, thanks for watching. Appreciate all the support, and I will talk to you next time.